Hi, and welcome to my diverse experiences presentation. I went to an event, a multicultural event, for this class about Native Americans. And was talking to Elise, our classmate, and she informed me that Indigenous peoples or just Native is preferred. So I'm going to try to say that. But if I catch myself and I say Native Americans, I apologize in advance. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So let me share my screen. I want this one. Okay, great. So again, my presentation is going to be about Native Americans or natives or indigenous people. So I'm going to try to say the preferred term, but again, I apologize. So let's get started. So Native American means First Nation person, which are those people who were original settlers in the United States, as I'm sure we all know. The Native Americans were grouped into tribes or nations, usually based on the area that they lived or their culture, such as their religion, customs, and language that they spoke, because it's a lot of different languages, sometimes even in one tribe. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, indicate that there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and 9 of those are in South Dakota. So there are definitely some that are not federally recognized, which just means they don't get money, I guess, or kind of resources. I can't find a lot of information about them because, again, they're not federally recognized. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that are. And like I said, there's 9 in South Dakota, and according to the US Census Bureau, there are about 4.5 million Indigenous people in the United States today, which is about 1.5% of the population. So I do believe it is important for us to know about this group of people and kind of know their story. So in terms of their story, their experiences are not the best, as you probably are aware of. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, there were Indian wars, and there were just a relentless aggression between the United States government, which caused Native people to lose their homeland. There was broken treaties, forced reallocations, that displaced Indians from their land of their ancestors, where they had been living for generations. So they moved from these lands to reservations where they most live now. Reservation lands offer a fraction of the size of the land that they had previous, and their natural resources were taken away from them. Many tribes were split and combined with traditional enemies or forced to reservations that were really far from their home and their sacred spaces that they had. Laws like the 1887 Dawes Act reinforced the dependency of reservation systems with land reallocation that set forth to destroy the tribe basically as a unit. So the 1800s to the mid 1900s, the US government enacted legislation that forcibly removed Native children from their homes and placed them in these Christian boarding schools. And I'll talk about this a little bit more because the multicultural event I went to talked about it, but we're just kind of mention it right now. So these children were taken away from their families hundreds of miles away to face severe discipline. We all know those who are racially and ethnically diverse typically have worse discipline in schools. If they tried to speak their language or practice their tradition, they were punished. Many children actually died from malnutrition or disease in these boarding schools. Those who did survive returned years later to find themselves completely disconnected from their family and their traditional ways. They no longer understood the native culture, language, anything that they previously knew. Um, Many natives who did attend boarding school lost their sense of self through enforced shaming of their cultural identity. These schools didn't want these children to be native anymore, which makes me so sad. As a result, these children were raised with little awareness about their native heritage and became disconnected from their tribal ways of knowing their culture. So today, many tribes in the United States are trying to revive their traditions and their cultures because of this experience in the past. Central to this is this idea of cultural renaissance, which just highlights the importance of language and ceremonies. A number of tribes have created language learning programs, which allows them to preserve and pass on their tribal language to future generations, which I think is so great. There's been ceremonies that are returned into practice. Local radio stations have began to broadcast in native languages. Powwows have become an intertribal gathering space, and there's a new native generation that is taught to live with dignity, character, and pride. So, no other group of people has quite the rich and storied culture as those of the native or indigenous peoples. They have a history rich in struggle and strife and triumph. There are so many aspects to our modern life that were adapted from the old Indian centuries that were practiced centuries ago. Um, Many familiar symbols that we take for granted were actually originated by the native. The teepee, the totem pole, the peace pipe, moccasins are just a few examples of each of these symbols that were actually integral parts of their culture, and they were symbols, but they were eventually wove into a tapestry of kind of this native life that few people know the origin of. So there's everything from native plants to animals to housing, and even weather became part of the culture for Indian life. Animals were revered as spirits, and although they were hunted and killed, their skins and hides were used as clothing or as drums, and their meat was never wasted, and their spirits lived in the mind of the tribes. They really saw animals as kind of almost like a god, if you compare it to like the Greeks, maybe, and they were worshipped. Everything was used, nothing was gone to waste. Plants were cultivated and harvested, and they would use them for dyes or blankets or medicine. And the rain and sun were considered to be gods, which giving a sign to the Indians that the seasons were changing. So just all of these things that we don't think about, they what really originated in indigenous people's culture. So just continuing here with culture, totem poles were actually a very integral part of Native culture. The Indians believed that each person was assigned the spirit of a particular animal and that their spirit was absorbed into this animal in death. So the totem pole is this large, tall wooden carving of various animals. I'm sure we've all seen it before. And each of these animals represent a family member of a loved one who have passed away. So many people also see dream catchers, which you can see them in people's car rearview mirrors or in their bedroom, but actually few know their significance. So a dream catcher is based on a legend told by the Lakota tribe, and it really symbolizes holding on to good things in life, while the holes in the catcher are there to filter out the bad thoughts and feelings. The other parts of the catcher catch those happy times. And then smoke signals are another interesting aspect of Native American culture. They were used to communicate to other tribes or just others out there over long distances. And they're yet another symbol of the proud heritage of Indigenous people. So, some challenges. While there is triumph, there's also challenge. And in the United States, violence against Indigenous women has reached unprecedented levels on tribal lands and in Alaska Native villages as well. More than 4 in 5 Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence, and more than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Specifically to Alaska Native women, they continue to suffer at the highest rate of forcible sexual assault and have reported rates of domestic violence up to 10 times higher than the rest of the United States. Although this data is limited, there is a number of missing and murdered Indigenous and Alaska Native women, and there's a real lack of diligent and adequate federal response. which is really alarming to the Indigenous women, tribal governments, and tribal communities because nothing is being done about these missing and murdered women. On some reservations, Indigenous women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. And the work done by these authors, Coulter et al. 2020, really just has drawn connections between Indigenous land rights, environmental protection, and human rights. So they're kind of an advocate for all of those areas. And in this article, it stated that Indian nations and tribes and other Indigenous communities throughout the world are afflicted by poverty, poor health, discrimination, and when Indigenous peoples are deprived of their ways of life and their ties to this earth, they suffer. And many have really disappeared completely. So, for too long, we've seen Indigenous peoples around the world that have been marginalized, subject to unjust and discriminatory legal systems and practices. There's large disparities in economic and political power that make Indigenous people especially vulnerable to wrongdoing. And for more than 30 years, these researchers have worked to build a legal framework to help Indigenous people win recognition of their human rights, which includes the right to exist as distinct peoples and cultures, right to be free from discrimination and forced assimilation, which kind of goes back to those boarding schools, and right of self determination and other essential rights. So, in regards to land rights, these authors noted that Indian nations and tribes and other indigenous communities throughout the world are afflicted by poverty, poor health, and discrimination, which subject them to grave human rights abuses, and many Native communities are actually under siege. So, Indian land and natural resources are often degraded, sometimes destroyed, and when they're deprived of their ways of life, they again suffer. So the team works to change this unjust and unworkable legal framework that's applied to native tribes. And that's really the core of their work here in the United States. In terms of Alaskan Native nations, they live under a system of federal law that's really unconstitutional. It's obsolete at this point and so flawed that it makes all of these Native nations impossible for them to improve their economic and social conditions. So, just clarifying and improving federal Indian law is absolutely necessary for Indian nations to gain that meaningful control of their life and their lands, to improve their economic and social well being. If tribes could solve their own problems and if they had a genuine opportunity, I'm sure they would take it. But the laws applied to them are so unreasonably fair that within the Constitution, there's honestly nothing they can do, which is so unfortunate. So, this goes into the knowledge and skills we can have as school psychologists to better support Indigenous youth. And I picked this article before we had to read it for class, so you already kind of know what it's about. So, NASP released a position statement in 2020 to discuss the effective service delivery for Indigenous children, youth, families, and communities. So, they provide many culturally responsive practices with Indigenous youth, which are all here on this graphic. I'm not going to read all these to you because you read the article, but I just kind of want to explain the graphic in a little more detail if you didn't get that from the article. So, first, we see the 4 points of the Black Star, which include sovereignty, language, intentionality, and reciprocity. And these all address elements essential to understanding how and when to build relationships. Next, the 4 points of the Red Star, which includes spiritual, cognitive, academic, social, emotional, behavioral, and physical, address the key elements of being human. Those are all parts of all of us. The blue background of the model represents the elements that flow throughout the other components. So just as in Indigenous cultures, where rituals and beliefs form a spiritual connection with nature, the water kind of flows as one of the sustaining and most critical life forces. That's why they chose blue. It's like water. And the four feathers at the bottom represent the alliance between NASP, the Indigenous American Subcommittee, and the Nations for Whom School Psychologists Advocate. I found it super helpful. I'm definitely going to keep this paper for my future use, especially if you're staying in South Dakota or the surrounding areas. So in terms of resources, I just wanted something outside of that NASP article to give me some more resources on Indigenous people. So I found this one from the National Indian Education Association, and they bring educators together to explore ways to improve schools and the education of Native children. So they promote maintenance and development of Native languages and cultures. They develop strategies for influencing local, state, and federal policymakers. The NIEA partners with any organization that they want to work with to further their mission. So as you can see, 72% of students are enrolled in a public school, and yet only 53% of those students will graduate. So there's a lot of them in our schools, and there's a lot of them that don't graduate. So this NIEA advocates to ensure they receive a high quality education. And there's so many helpful resources and events that NIEA puts out that I think would be beneficial for all of us. Again, they kind of they'll help you if you reach out. So if you have a school that's really struggling and don't feel like your Indigenous peoples are getting adequate education, then this would definitely be a resource for that. Okay, so the multicultural event that I went to featured Larry Spotted Crowman, and he spoke about the spiritual, cultural, and social significance of Indigenous peoples. He is not from South Dakota. I think he's actually from Massachusetts, which I think is wild. You don't really think of, Native people in other states, but they're everywhere. So he talked about many different topics, such as rituals, ceremonies, suicides, and other struggles that his tribe, which is the Nipmuc Native Americans, face. I was especially interested when Larry spoke about the Native children, obviously, and how they were taken from their families, enrolled in boarding schools. Until I did my own research for this presentation, I really didn't know how harsh they were to these children. Larry talked about how if they spoke their native language, they would, quote, get their tongues cut out, end quote, which is so harsh for a child who just speaks their language. Many of the children didn't know their history because it was taken away from them at a young age. And Native Americans really have to tell their own story, which is based off society, which tells them they're nobodies and that they don't belong, which is not true at all. And besides being taken away from their families and shoved into these boarding schools, Native American children also face the crisis of suicide and opioid overdose. So Larry gave us some stats, which were kind of surprising to me. From 2014 to 2016, there were 24 opioid suicides in Massachusetts, which is where he lives and where his tribe is, with natives there. And he said that one child every month dies in a tribal community due to an opioid overdose or a death by suicide. So if I think of these children on these reservations or somewhere else in their tribe and one of them dies every month, that's 12 kids a year from opioid overdose or death by suicide. And that gives me goosebumps, and I just feel like there's a problem and nobody's doing anything about it. And the Native Americans are beyond crisis. He said that they require assistance from others, and he said there's a deeper connection that we can all be a part of, and we need to come together as a nation. And I think that's so true, especially right now. So I do have a video, so I'm just gonna stop this screen share and then start another screen share. And it's not long, so it shouldn't take very long. So let me make this bigger. And this is a BBC production, and they're on a South Dakota reservation. So I'll let them kind of talk about it.
America can stand back right now and watch as my own people attack some of our traditional people for believing in our own Lakota way of life.
The media often portrays us as like these sad, like poverty-stricken people.
You know, there isn't that focus on who we are today.
We live on the poorest county in America. It's poverty-stricken. But just because we live in poverty don't mean we're poor.
Do you feel American?
I've always been that we were Indian. We were Lakota first before we were anything else, before we were Christian, before we were American.
Okay, so I've just woke up in the Rosebud Reservation here in South Dakota. I'm on a beautiful ranch with lots of chickens and horses. I'm going to be spending a few days here sleeping in people's houses and in the Pine Ridge Reservation about 2 hours from here. I want to find out what it's like to live here, but also how younger people can envisage their future and how they feel about modern day America as a Native American.
Around here it's kind of hard because all the drugs and alcohol.
So it's a very hard place to grow up in a lot of ways.
The majority of people that are working on the res, you either work at the tribal office or IHS.
Not much to do around here. And when you do find something to do, you usually have to travel 20 miles or so longer.
There's a lot of suicides and that kind of stuff.
People lose hope and they feel maybe oppressed.
We've all fallen as teenagers around here. We've all experimented with alcohol and things.
It's really sad to have alcohol here.
One thing about these kids here is they're survivors and they're fighters. And a lot of them are wanting change. They want something different. They want something better than our adults are leaving them.
We actually don't believe in the word Native American because Native American, it also has the word American in it.
They took everything from us. America's built on stolen lands. America is a stolen country.
We used to live with everything, and now we're on these little reservations and we're all clumped together, and we shouldn't be like that.
Like non-natives see us as these historic people with loincloth and headdress.
Because you see the Washington Redskins, you see the Cleveland Indians, you see all of that and it's a big joke, and you hear, everybody knows the phrase drunken Indian.
We may live in this really rough situation, and it's very real, but that there's hope and that our culture is alive still.
I think it's important for our young people to have role models and to see other people going out and doing big things and coming back to the reservation and showing them that there's other things that out there and this is what we're doing and you can do this too,
Of course, there's high rates of suicide and alcoholism on any reservation, but that's because of the lack of ability to express oneself. Hi, we are Scattered Around. I'm Scotty Clifford.
And I'm Juliana Brownice.
I've recently just acquired a record deal in Los Angeles, so that'll be fun. As much as we can do just to show children here at home that we really need to get away from the poor, pitiful, pissed off Indian.
All that matters now is what we can do now.
This film is an opportunity to give, our youth, our Native youth, kind of these heroes and heroines to look up to. I think that's something that I wanted when I was growing up, was to see someone like myself. You don't see a lot of Native characters kind of leading in mainstream movies, in big blockbuster movies. It's always usually it's a predominantly white cast.
I want to see our people thrive and not get caught up in what outsiders think we are and stereotype us as, but rise up and show the world what we can do, basically.
Okay, so that was basically that video. Let me go back to my presentation. Okay, so that was the video, and then of course the 2 questions that you have to answer, what we've all been waiting for. So question number 1, how are you going to recognize the challenges that Native American children face? As a future school psychologist, what will you utilize from this presentation to do so? And number 2, do you feel competent in not only serving Native students, but all racially and ethnically diverse students? So those are my questions for you. You don't have to elaborate a lot. Just kind of give me your ideas. And yeah, so here's my references if you want anything for your future students. So that's all I have. So I'm going to stop my share, and I can't wait to watch all of your presentations. Bye.